Today is not the day I die.
You're going to fight that?
I'm going to kill that.
Game of Thrones is one of the most significant television shows of the decade, and to celebrate its finale, The Take put out the call to a bunch of us video essayists, asking us to each examine a single episode of the series and talk about what made it special. We're calling it The Best of Thrones. Now, for me, no two words are more meaningless in film and television criticism right now than subverting expectations, but they weren't always meaningless. One of the reasons Game of Thrones was such a breath of fresh air was how it not only subverted expectations, but did so naturally. Sure, it was surprising, but Joffrey having Ned executed didn't come out of nowhere. It was completely in line with Joffrey's character and where everyone was on the board at that time. So then why were we surprised? It was surprising because of its place in the larger context of fantasy literature and media more generally. Traditionally, main characters have what is called plot armor. Even if it was completely logical for a main character to die in a dangerous situation, they would usually survive because they were main characters. Even if we didn't know it, those were our expectations. But Thrones was so fresh because of how it subverted those expectations. Characters made choices that surprised us. It became a selling point for the show. Hello Future Me made a great video discussing how a moment like the Red Wedding was a terrific example of expectation subverting. Go check that out if you haven't already. But what happens a few seasons in when the audience starts predicting the unpredictable? What happens when they expect tragedy? How do you maintain tension? Well, in Game of Thrones' case, you subvert their expectations by not subverting them. And to explain what that means, you need to take a close look at one episode. Season 4, Episode 8, The Mountain and the Viper. It is what I believe to be the best episode the series has produced, and it is a masterclass in using the audience's subverted expectations against them. So, I'm gonna walk through how Game of Thrones achieves this by examining Episode 8's place in the 4th season, talking about the construction of the episode, and finally taking a closer look at the fight itself. Oberyn Martell has a full 29 minutes of screen time during the entirety of Game of Thrones, but Oberyn leaves enough of an impression in those 29 minutes to easily justify his place as one of, if not my favorite character on the show. Oberyn's introduction in the first episode of Season 4 sums up pretty much everything you need to know about the Dornish prince. He's confident, he's passionate, he's dangerous, he's funny, and most importantly, he hates Lannisters. And we learn that Oberyn is in the capital for Joffrey's wedding, but he also has the least ulterior motive of all time. Oberyn Martell wants justice. You see, as we hear again and again over the course of Season 4, Oberyn had a sister named Elia Martell. Elia was the former princess of the Seven Kingdoms, married to Rhaegar Targaryen, the prince whose actions set in motion Robert's rebellion, the war that ended with the defeat of House Targaryen and Robert Baratheon on the Iron Throne. As part of the sack on King's Landing, Elia Martell was raped and murdered by Tywin Lannister's one-man army, the Mountain. The Mountain then killed Elia Martell's 2 children. The official story is that they were killed by the Mountain acting alone, but Oberyn believes that this was an order given to the Mountain by Tywin Lannister because Elia Martell's children hold a claim to the throne. So even though Oberyn has traveled to King's Landing for Joffrey and Marjorie's wedding, he really wants to use this as an opportunity to bring justice to the people that were responsible for the death of his sister and children. And that puts Oberyn in a really interesting place for the rest of Season 4. He's able to wear his heart on his sleeve, even though he doesn't come out and say it. Everyone knows what Oberyn's after, which means he doesn't need to play politics like everyone else on the show up until this point. Oberyn just needs to wait for an opportunity and strike. And this is where the expectation subverting gets so fun. In any similar fantasy story, a character in Oberyn's position would defeat his enemies. It may come as some great cost, but justice would be served. But of course, our expectations for Game of Thrones are such that we would never expect that a likable, honest prince with an honorable goal would succeed. This isn't your typical fantasy world. This is Game of Thrones. We're expecting it to subvert our expectations. Especially with the Red Wedding at the end of Season 3, we just witnessed the death of Robb Stark, a very similar character to Oberyn. Likable, honest, and with an honorable goal. Everything we have learned up until this point would lead us to believe that Oberyn will fail. And yet, Season 4 seemed to be going in a different direction, specifically when you looked at the events taking place at King's Landing. Joffrey, the series' villain, was poisoned on his wedding day. The Tyrells, the new seemingly honorable house, was gaining power and challenging the dominance of the Lannisters. The bad guys were finally getting theirs. Maybe this was the moment where things were going to turn around. And these actions weren't without consequences. Tyrion was put on trial for Joffrey's murder, since Cersei gonna Cersei, and after things went south, Tyrion gave up on the system and decided to find his own justice by demanding a trial by combat. But none of Tyrion's friends would defend him, which left Tyrion without a champion, and wouldn't you know it, Cersei had picked the Mountain as her champion. All hope was lost. And then, in comes Oberyn Martell. After waiting a whole 2 weeks, he has found his opportunity to deliver his justice, fight for Tyrion Lannister against the Mountain in front of everyone, and finally avenge his sister and her children. And when Oberyn explains his desire for justice, Tyrion responds in your classic cynical Game of Thrones fashion. If you're looking for justice, you've come to the wrong place. Tyrion has been watching the show. He knows that Game of Thrones always subverts your expectations. This isn't a fairy tale. There are not happy endings and there is no justice. But Oberyn disagrees. He explains that fate has put everyone exactly where they need to be. It's the sort of situation that you would expect from a fantasy story, and Oberyn hasn't been wrong yet. If there was a neat and poetic way to get Tyrion out of trouble and get some revenge in the process, this was it. And after Game of Thrones had spent 3 seasons subverting our expectations by doing the opposite of what we would expect from a fantasy story, was season 4 going to subvert our subverted expectations? Was the surprise going to come from everything working out the way we would have expected? And how could episode 8, the episode in which the fight between the Mountain and the Viper would take place, help to further set our expectations? A lot of good Game of Thrones episodes use their seemingly disconnected storylines to explore a certain theme, and The Mountain and the Viper is no exception. We check in on 5 undercard stories before the big title fight. First thing that happens in the episode, Molestown is raided by the wildlings, Gilly is caught by Ygritte, and to Gilly's surprise, Ygritte lets Gilly go. In Meereen, Grey Worm gets caught checking out Missandei, and to his surprise, Missandei reciprocates his affections and their relationship begins. Also in Meereen, Barristan discovers that Jorah has been spying on Daenerys for the Westerosi government. He approaches Jorah. Jorah tries to explain himself, but he can't, and instead of having him killed for treason, Daenerys gives Jorah a light punishment and Jorah is banished. At the Vale, Littlefinger is interrogated after Lysa Arryn's apparent suicide. He tries to talk his way out of trouble, but it seems that the elders of the Vale suspect Littlefinger is involved. And when Sansa is brought in for questioning, Littlefinger is surprised that she corroborates his lie and Littlefinger is safe. This episode has a clear theme. Characters are caught in dangerous situations, but to their surprise, they are spared. They manage to evade the kind of consequences that Game of Thrones is famous for, even though their situation is just as dire. This is a Game of Thrones episode about mercy. And yes, this episode also contains Ramsay's takeover of Moat Cailin with Theon's help. There's still cruelty in this world, but it seems isolated. This scene is the exception in the episode, not the rule. And this scene leads to Roose Bolton accepting Ramsay as a member of his house, a scene that can almost for a second trick you into forgetting that Ramsay is a homicidal psychopath. Good things are happening to characters. And then we have Tyrion and Jaime's conversation as they await Tyrion's trial. Besides probably being a subtle jab at Ender's Game writer Orson Card, simple cousin Orson who does nothing but crush beetles, this scene is Tyrion pleading his case one last time. Tyrion does not understand killing. He isn't that kind of person. Doesn't Tyrion deserve to live? Can there be justice? And in his final moments before the trial, Tyrion lets a bug go. One last act of mercy. So we went into the Mountain and the Viper confused. What should we expect? Will Tyrion survive? Will Oberyn get his justice? Our normal expectations for a fantasy story say yes. Oberyn, the noble hero out for justice, will win. But our past experience with Game of Thrones says that the show will subvert those expectations and Oberyn will lose. But this season has suggested that maybe the show has turned a corner, and the way it will subvert our expectations will be to not subvert our expectations at all. And the episode leading up to the fight has only made it more confusing. The other stories have been about characters escaping life-threatening situations. Circumstances presented them with mercy. And now, to top it all off, a man is about to attempt to avenge his sister and her children while fighting to free a man who is about to be executed for a crime he didn't commit. Is anyone more deserving of mercy than Tyrion? Is Oberyn really going to win? And then the fight itself calls on a few tropes to continue to play with our expectations. expectations. First, Tyrion, one of the more relatable characters, is scared. Our expectations are aligned with Tyrion. Oberyn isn't wearing very much armor, Oberyn is drinking, we and Tyrion are worried. But Oberyn isn't worried. Even when he sees the mountain and everyone else recoils, Oberyn is still confident. Oberyn knows something we don't. Then the mountain and the viper enters the arena, and Oberyn uses the opportunity to show off, spins his spear, bows to the crowd, he's cocky, and the mountain isn't. It's reminiscent of the sword trick from Indiana Jones. Oberyn's hubris is going to be his downfall, and if this show is really ready to subvert our expectations, it would be now. The mountain would pull out a proverbial gun and shoot Oberyn dead. In practical terms, the mountain would cut Oberyn in half with one swing of his sword while Oberyn was mid-flip. We know it's coming, but Oberyn parries the mountain's first attack. We breathe a sigh of relief. This is actually going to be a fight. We're cautiously optimistic. And then Oberyn lays it on. He starts repeating his mantra. My sister is Oberyn Martell. You raped my sister. You murdered her. You killed her children. And Oberyn is starting to sound like another character from fantasy literature. The Princess Bride's Inigo Montoya, the Spanish fencing master on a quest to avenge his father. If you haven't seen The Princess Bride, you've surely seen some version of this trope. As Inigo Montoya fights the six-fingered man who killed his father, he repeats a three-sentence phrase that he has crafted for this very moment. Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die. Oberyn is Westeros' Inigo, and Inigo won. For the next 2 minutes, Game of Thrones turns into The Princess Bride, and Oberyn is doing surprisingly well against the mountain. He's in complete control of the fight, deflecting the mountain's blows, knocking his helmet off, toying with the mountain like a bullfighter toys with a bull, all while repeating his phrase. And nearly a quarter of this 2-minute long fight is focused on the audience. We're cutting between the action in the arena and the reactions of Valeria, Tywin, Jaime, Cersei, and of course Tyrion. Tyrion, like us, doesn't want to hope. He's apprehensive, but as things progress, he gets hopeful. And since Tyrion is hopeful, we let our guard down. It's happening. The tide is going to turn. And finally, the music really kicks in, and Oberyn stabs the mountain, leaving his spear in the mountain as the mountain falls to the ground. We were right to believe in mercy. But then the difference between Oberyn and Inigo becomes clear. Inigo wanted the six-fingered man, but Oberyn doesn't want the mountain. And Oberyn removes the spear, essentially rewinding the last 10 seconds until before he won the fight. And our expectations are subverted one last time. And I tweeted about this, twitter.com/NandoVMovies, please follow. The camera does something really brilliant after Oberyn removes the spear. It follows Oberyn down to his feet, and you see how close he still is to the mountain. And then, well, you know. So how does a show like Game of Thrones continue to keep the audience on its toes? Can surprising deaths and subverted expectations last forever? In normal circumstances, no. But Game of Thrones realized that in season 4 and did everything possible to subvert our subverted expectations. It introduced a character from a different kind of story, one where the good guys win and the bad guys lose. And like one of those stories, it did everything in its power to give that character the opportunity to get his revenge. And it used the rest of the episode leading up to the final confrontation to trick us into thinking things would be different this time, and even the fight itself tricked us. It wasn't until Oberyn pulled the spear out of the mountain that the show started feeling like its old self, but we didn't have enough time to mentally prepare for the result, so it hit us hard, in a way that no other show could. And that is why I believe the Mountain and the Viper represents the best of Game of Thrones. So I'm totally sick right now and I look like a mess, so for the on-camera bit, I'm just going to use videos of Jaime Lannister. I bet you won't even be able to tell the difference. So thank you to everyone who continues to support the channel on Patreon. You guys are the best. If you want to see your name up here, get access to videos early, other cool stuff, throw in literally any amount of money at patreon.com/NandoVMovies. You have no idea how much I appreciate it. Also, thank you to the team at The Take and to everyone else that has made these videos. Definitely go and check those out and make your own if you are interested. There is a lot of good to talk about in Game of Thrones. And definitely, if you enjoyed listening to me talk about Game of Thrones, find Mostly Nitpicking, my podcast, and me and my co-host DJ, along with friend of the show Chris Diggins, do a weekly Game of Thrones recap show called After the Thrones, which it started as an after show for an after show, like that was the joke, but that's not an after show anymore. At least that's not what it's called. So now ours is just called After the Thrones, which is very confusing to to people, but just think of it as a Game of Thrones episode recap show. We've done them for the last few seasons, and you can find them on the feed for Mostly Nitpicking. Last thing, as always, follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/NandoVMovies. For no good reason, it means a lot to me. I know a lot of you guys already do, which is super cool. I've got a lot of awesome videos coming up, a couple of pitches, a bunch of small changes, so that's where I'll be putting updates on them and stuff like that. Like I said, here's the link to the playlist for the rest of these videos. Go watch them. That's all I got. I'll see you next time.